Well, friend, hello.
Friend, hello.
So good to see you, Rosemarie. And I'm so just overjoyed at our connection over the years and that this event is coming into being and what might be next for this collaborative work around the story and the life of Helen Keller. And so I thought for our conversation today, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how our lives have intersected thus far in this work, and then maybe what's next. What's coming into being. How long has it been that we've known each other now? I was trying to remember the year that we met. Was it 2018?
I'm not good about that. I would say it's probably been 5 years, maybe more.
Yeah, I think it was about 5 years ago that you wandered into the Swedenborg Chapel. And what were you doing in Cambridge that day?
Of course, I have no idea what I was doing in Cambridge that day, but I was there for some event. And I had been in Cambridge at Harvard several times because I'm a teacher, I'm a scholar, I'm a talker. And so if you are that kind of person, the force of life brings you to Cambridge. And I was staying in a little guest house somewhere, and it was a Sunday morning. And I was making what I call pilgrimages. Whenever I visit someplace, I make pilgrimages. I go to the sacred spaces for me. And very often they are new sacred spaces if I'm in a place that is somewhat unfamiliar. But for Cambridge, I was making my pilgrimages to the sacred spaces that I knew. So one of those spaces is the Sanders Theater, which I've attended so many events there. I love to go into that building because it's a beautiful sacred space that's saturated with, it's haunted maybe, with people from the past that are lost. There's the Colonel Shaw and all of those men and women, but mostly men, who were connected to Harvard, who were lost in the various wars. And when you go in, you see all these plaques. And it's like a version of a cemetery, which is a sacred space that carries a story of someone who is lost. And to me, as I said, it's a pilgrimage, a witnessing of the miracle that we are gathered here, those of us who right now are alive in the world together. What a gift that is, but what a perilous and rare opportunity that is to literally be together in the world with so many people that are still flesh and blood, and that we have the chance to find them and be with them. So that's the context of my pilgrimage that Sunday morning when it's cold and rainy. And so I was headed toward Sanders Theater to witness this, to see the Shaw Memorial, and just to do those things that I do. And I love that opportunity when I go on what I call my work trips, to have this time. And so I walked by the Swedenborgian church, that stone chapel, which is clearly a sacred space that I'd seen before, but never had the opportunity to go into. And because it was Sunday morning, the door was open. And I never pass a sacred space or an historical building that has a door open without going in. So I walked in, and there you were, standing there up in the front with this purple robe on. There you were, a woman, at the end of this service talking about the Helen Keller Center. And I sat in the back and I thought, a Helen Keller Center. I know about Helen Keller. I can't
Yes.
wait to find
Mhm.
this woman who said her name was Sage Cole. I thought, that is the most poetic name I have ever heard in my life. But there you were. So I
And
came up to you afterward and I said, I know so much about Helen Keller. I want
mhm.
to I want to be involved in making this thing you're describing. And here we are.
And here we are, five
Here
years
we are.
later. Yes, I remember that day very vividly. I remember your arrival on the scene, and it felt like just a incredibly providential
Right.
occurrence, because this vision that I've had for I think it had been in the works for a while when I met you. Just no idea how it was going to come to be. And your arrival and your expertise and your love and your care and has been so vital to all of the all of that all that has occurred since that day.
Well, it
And I
meant
love.
so much to me to get this framework for Helen Keller
Mhm.
because in the world of cultural disability studies and even history, there's a critical view of Helen Keller because um, many of the scholars that I work with, the academics, the teachers, feel that Helen Keller has been too much sentimentalized, that the overcoming narrative has been a bit much, that there's treacle that runs off of much about
Yeah.
Helen Keller.
Yeah.
And I heard you talking about Helen Keller as an inspirational figure in a way that felt fresh and promising to me. And I
I'm glad
wanted
to.
to move out of this academic, snotty Helen Keller place
Mhm.
that my friends have been in.
Sure.
And I
Sure.
respect everything they've done about Helen Keller. But I'm so drawn to the place
Mhm.
and the idea of Helen Keller walking by the Swedenborgian church, thinking about Swedenborgianism, which I knew very little about,
Mhm.
uh,
Mhm.
on her way to Radcliffe. And that historical situatedness,
Yeah.
placeness of Helen
Yeah.
Keller there, I thought that's that's something I want to be able to contribute
Mhm.
to.
Yeah. Well, and even framing that question of sort of snottiness or the criticism of Helen Keller, I think it is reasonably placed, and in large part, that's I think there's a piece of that in the vision that I have is that I think she needs to be enfleshed. Her story has
Yes.
been very shaped and framed by the people in her life at the time. And, anytime celebrity becomes a part of your life, you kind of probably lose hold of some of what's really true. And, I was struck when I learned that, she graduated from Radcliffe, but it wasn't another 50 years until another deafblind person had that experience that while she did so much for the disability community, she was set apart as well. And I think at the heart of my vision of this work is to stop setting each other apart, to lift up the gifts and the wisdom and the love that everybody has to bring, at every stage of life, at every, whether we are able-bodied or disabled, that we all have something to offer, and that really is a part of her story, and yet it gets turned and twisted by when we think of her as a saint or somebody who stands apart from history. And yeah, there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm just so drawn to her. I think as a minister, someone who has been called to create spiritual community, to share the message of God's love, and having wonderful experiences of that, but also feeling the limits of how we gather around faith, how we live our faith. There's so much, conflict amongst religious communities, and difficulty being in conversation. And I'm just so moved by how Helen moved in so many worlds, lived in so many, and was able to communicate across so many disciplines, which again is kind of what's fun about meeting you, because you come from a different discipline, a different world of meaning making. I wonder if you would share a bit about your world of meaning making and what does draw you to Helen, or what you're hoping to bring into the world that might be tied to this collaborative.
Well, I'm an English teacher. That's a place to start. Mm-hmm. And I'm an English teacher because that's probably not just the best, but maybe the only thing I could do to make a living, to be in the world, to contribute. So I have what I call pretty significant disability. I have very unusual arms and hands that I've had since birth. And so I went through the world being different, but also being very aware of how much the same I was as other human beings, how you can be different and the same at once. And to think, of course, I had a completely unremarkable childhood and life and education. But I was always aware of, as I said, this differentness and this sameness that I experienced, and never really thought of it in terms of my having a disability, because that language wasn't really available to me until the women's movement and the Black civil rights movement and the disability rights movement changed the way we all thought about the promise of equality and equal opportunity that is offered to us in America with the Declaration of Independence that says all people, so men, but it means all people are created equal. What does that actually mean? And so when I went to school and studied literature because I loved stories, because I couldn't really do anything else, when I went to college and when I went to graduate school and learned about these different movements and the knowledge initiatives that came from them, when I learned about women's history, African American studies, queer theory, these transformative knowledge, like I said, enterprises. I like to be pretentious, and that's a pretentious word. I realized that there was much to be done about disability in that, these human variations we think of as disabilities. So Helen Keller was always on the edge of that. Many of my colleagues worked on Helen Keller. I began to teach her work. I always taught in my literature classes or my women's writing classes or feminist theory class, any kind of class I would teach. I like to teach the story of my life. And I wrote a piece called The Story of My Work, which was in part inspired by Helen Keller's work. I'll have to find it and send it to you.
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
And then when I had the chance to spend a year at Harvard, I spent some time with Helen Keller there in some ways because I knew that she went to Radcliffe. But what was also transformational to me is to learn that Helen Keller is buried in the Washington National Cathedral, which is a sacred space that I spent much time at. I taught at Howard University and lived in Northern Virginia for a decade. And I would go to the Washington National Cathedral often. And I knew that Helen Keller was buried there and that she rested across the aisle from Matthew Shepard, a man from my area of the country, the Mountain West, who was killed because he was a gay man. And I thought the juxtaposition, the ritual, the emplacement of those two people side by side in the Washington National Cathedral was an extremely moving thing. And that it was emblematic of America in a very important way. I mean, if anyone has ever gone to cathedrals, as many of us have in other places, you go to Winchester Cathedral and there's Jane Austen. You go to other cathedrals and there's Winston Churchill. I mean, it goes on. And that we have Helen Keller and Matthew Shepard together in the Washington National Cathedral is something that I think we need to narrate more fully. But we have Helen Keller in all these other places. I go to the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco, where I live, which is a beautiful late 19th century arts and crafts chapel that you've been in. It's a small chapel with Gothic arches made out of trees from the Santa Cruz Mountains. It's so beautiful. There's a fireplace, very small stained glass windows, and off in the corner is a baptismal font, a big shell, one of those like Botticelli in the Venus shell. And it was the baptismal font of Robert Frost, the famous American poet whose mother was a Swedenborgian. And this was an epiphany to me when I saw this, because suddenly I thought, of course, the Swedenborgians brought nature to the American transcendentalists and then to Robert Frost. So there was a genealogy for me created there from Swedenborgianism to the transcendentalists, to Thoreau and to Emerson, and then down to Frost, and then to me, through that baptismal font and that heritage, that ancestry was extraordinarily meaningful. And I felt like I had been kind of guided in some way to you and to Robert Frost's baptismal font and to somehow a revisitation of the Washington National Cathedral with these new meanings. So what I would like to contribute is some narrative that I just, my family said, went on and on about, but also to make something that brings this story of me in school and Helen Keller in school and me on my witnessing pilgrimages to you and to the font and to the cathedral, that Helen Keller has somehow made possible.
I love the way you talk about space and the sacredness of space and the physicality of beautiful things and places. And there's something in that, especially speaking about Robert Frost. And, my Swedenborgian tradition is so interesting because it has put out tendrils all over the planet as these ideas have kind of moved into the culture and influenced thinkers and activists, people like Helen Keller. And it's such an interesting juxtaposition because it really does feel like the largest influence of the church has been far beyond congregational life. And yet we have these beautiful buildings, congregations built that were built by congregations. And anyway, there's something being woven together that is collaborative and it's not linear. And especially now that this effort is not at this moment housed any longer at the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge. We're bringing humans together. We're bringing ideas together. But I think in a very powerful way, we want those ideas to come together to really create things, whether that's experiences in places. And I'm excited. You've been sharing with me, and we've been talking about this idea of doing a pilgrimage to the National Cathedral, having a experience there with Helen, with Matthew. And even though the dream of the center in Cambridge is on pause at the moment, I think we both hold this dream that, well, maybe there'll be many Helen Keller centers one day in many sacred spaces around the world, because we need space, and we need spaces that are reimagined, because so many of the sacred spaces that do exist are not accessible, wouldn't have actually even been welcoming to Helen in her day. And
Well, I
we're
think
in
it
that
would be
soup right
useful
now.
to take the Swedenborgian chapel, the essence of it in Cambridge, the placeness of it, to take what was Helen's out of there. And we've talked about this, the many other Helen things that might be in your national headquarters. We laughed together about trying to find Helen things. And you said there was a sculpture of Swedenborgian's a bust that
Yes.
Helen Keller must have touched. And then we laughed because you said, I want to find Helen Keller's brandy glass.
Right. Whiskey.
And,
yes.
Yes. And I work closely with a beloved colleague, David Serlin, who's an historian. And I really want to get him involved because so that we can find maybe some Helen Keller things. And then we can take those Helen Keller things, us being among them, on the road.
Yeah.
We can go to places and make our Helen Keller pilgrimage also a Helen Keller presentation. We can create a Helen Keller ritual that we can bring, I don't know, to my San Francisco Swedenborgian church, to many other places that would be interested in a Helen Keller meditation, a Helen Keller ritual, a Helen Keller event.
Yeah.
How to put that together, how to fund it.
Yeah.
I'm telling you, the Mellon Foundation should do this.
Get on board. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think these are all the questions. Yeah. How to bring all of our interested parties and our different, as we talked about, disciplines. And, I've been moved. There's
my deaf blind friends, my deaf friends, my blind friends.
Yeah. 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 How to work together in this initiative and make space for lots of, I think my hope is that there can be really space for lots of different initiatives, but also this experience of togetherness.
Togetherness in place.
Place.
For all of us as enfleshed humans, we are always in a place. We always have a relationship with our environment. And those of us who live with, as I said, the human variations we think of as disabilities, we don't always fit into those spaces that are designed and built by people who I've sometimes called normates. And I've written about this. There's a phrase that I've used called misfits and misfitting. And really what misfitting has a great deal, what it's really about is the experience of place, of body and world coming together and fitting and not fitting. And Helen Keller is a marvelous example of a misfit in the world that was lived as a fitting in some very meaningful way. And that model of how to turn a misfit into a fit. Never thought of it that way, but that's what Helen Keller's life and her stories are about.
Yeah. Well, and that's such a powerful reflection that she was a misfit who became almost like that. I keep thinking of like a universal wrench. Like she fit everywhere. So
A
something about
universal wrench.
universal wrench. She could talk
Perfect.
to anybody. She could talk to anybody,
A
connect with
Swiss Army
anybody.
knife.
Yeah. And I almost feel like there's something wise in that of when we recognize our own misfitness, when we stop thinking we have to fit in, we actually become more fluid, more flexible, more able. And that's certainly one of my hopes to carry forward of her message is just this that we are all humans on this planet together. Like we do have, as you said, there's a lot more the same about you than that is different. We and that message, that reality is so often lost, in our conversations and our communities, and perhaps it comes back by recognizing our difference, but also our unity, which feels so essential to her beingness and what she brought to the world. And as Swedenborgians have often been considered misfits, so we're also kind of a misfit tradition in a way because we don't quite fit in
Right.
Protestantism or different religious, and we try to be a church, but we're also kind of a philosophical tradition, and we're also kind of I think we're kind of misfitty and maybe on our way to finding what kind of wrench we can be in the world. um Very interesting, very enlivening. So I know we'll be together on Saturday. We'll have a chance to speak live with the different presenters from the week. We'll have, I keep reminding myself, this is a celebration and event, but it's also just the next step on the journey, the next leg of the journey. And I hold a lot of hope that there'll be pilgrimages and there'll be art installations and there'll be, all kinds of things emerging in our future. How might you want to leave this conversation? What last gift of Rosemary? And I guess I really would love to hear you particular. You're an English teacher. You're so many things more. So many things. If you had a hope for right now, at this juncture, what might it be?
Well, I think it's what I was talking about, and that is we can make something together, something that's, I'm sorry to say, not virtual.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
understand that we have to do what we have to do in this way to start, but to make something that we could carry out into the world together.
Yeah.
And when
Yeah.
I say we, I'm imagining a really large group uh, of people that maybe are not talking about Helen Keller, but Helen would be a place to take off from.
I
I
often think
think,
about her as somebody in the circle. She's in the
yes,
circle like you are and like I am and
yeah,
whoever else will come along.
but
Mhm.
something material, something embodied. I mean, that was what was so exciting about the possibility of the Cambridge Church, having a center, but we can have a traveling center, as I mentioned, that we could gather some objects and host an exhibition somewhere. You and I talked about trying to talk the Widener Library into giving us a little space. We can get some curators involved in this. We can make something to bring somewhere. As I said, I always go into churches and I look for disability in those spaces. And one of the things you often see in churches, I'm sure you've seen this, is you see the prosthetics discarded. You see that the crutches, if you go to European churches, hanging in the rafters of the people that have been healed miraculously in a church. And I find that very moving, the idea of entering a church in a broken state and somehow being transformed. Now, there's a lot of criticism about that, the idea of healing, but I think we can retell that story in relation to Helen Keller, because Helen Keller was not transformed by healing. Helen Keller remained a deaf, blind, disabled woman her whole life, and she entered the world exactly as she was. And of course, that's what has made the disability rights movement and disability culture has made possible for so many of us now to enter the world as we are. And to think about entering the world as we are in the spirit of Helen Keller, in a space of sacred spaces of churches. Most of the sacred spaces I'm in are universities, but I want to be in the sacred spaces of churches more. So
I love that.
We can maybe make a Helen Keller something.
We can have a tour. We can
have
go
a
on
tour,
go
a
on
pilgrimage.
Yes, a pilgrimage, a revival. Who knows? I'm very moved by being in the world as we are, which I do feel is at the heart of the spiritual invitation. So much of religion, a lot of harm has been done in the name of religion in demeaning the way that we are. And so there's an opportunity for some healing in that story. And I also love that, right, this recognition. Helen was not healed of her blindness or her deafness, but she was she was healed by the connections that were made possible for her through Annie. And that also feels very alive in me around the collaborative, is how can we think of healing in regards to how we're connected to how we were given a space for belonging, how we're empowered to bring our gifts into the world. And
how disability is so often understood and experienced as damage.
Yes.
And then how it can be transformed from damage into a full life. I'm just reading now Salman Rushdie's account of his wounding at Chautauqua, and of how that transformed who he is. He's a fellow literary person and was in residence at my university, Emory University, for a number of years. And of course, we were colleagues there, but I didn't know him very well. But he was brought into our community there, and now he's brought into our community now in a different way. And I don't imagine that he has thought about at this point in his life that he is a member of disability culture, that he is now in some ways related to Helen Keller. But it would be interesting to think about how we can involve other people. Salman Rushdie comes to mind. There are many other people who are interested in or connected to disabled people, the lived experience of disability, who might be brought in. I know Michael J. Fox, of course, has a foundation. There are many connections. If we had some kind of a project that we could reach out to involve other people in, to bring forward the Helen Keller that we know and recognize, to do the kind of work we want Helen Keller to do, to tell a different story about disability.
Yeah. Well, and that articulation of seeing disability not as damage, but as a shift in the story. And I think a lot of people on this planet right now are ready for that knowledge that life is not just a story of becoming some perfect version of yourself and then getting a prize. Like, we're here for a time and then we're not. And all of us, that's true for all of us. And what are we going to do with the time we have?
And things happen to us along the way.
All of us.
Rushdie writes in this book that he'd always been mostly afraid of one thing, and that was becoming blind. For some reason, that to him was, well, he's a writer. And so he speaks of the irony that, as a as a writer, he ends up he's partially blind. He's blind in one of his eyes, but it's the becoming blind for him that is quite different from losing sight. And my colleague Georgina Kleek has talked about this, as other people have. Becoming blind, becoming disabled it's something different from losing your arm or losing an eye or losing something. It's gaining something. We talk about deaf gain and disability gain and gaining blindness. And Helen Keller her life was an example of that.
Yeah. And she writes so eloquently.
Became Helen Keller by becoming deaf-blind, not by losing anything. Right. So that retelling of the story of loss into the story of gain and what that can make over a lifetime, how one flourishes in that way. That's the story that we want to bring forward. And of course, there are many, many other stories. Rushdie is one of them.
Yes.
And I'm not sure he quite knows that yet, but we can try to find him.
We can help tell him. Yes, how much this world could be transformed as more people recognize those gifts, and instead of this sort of cordoning off. I mean, it just feels like we need more. We need more stories. We need more diverse stories of all that we gain as we dig deeper into what we're learning, the courage so many faculties are kind of turned on when we face challenge or perceived challenges and experiences. And I think Helen really writes, she articulates that so well. And that's where it really turns into the spiritual dimension, is that we're here in bodies, but we also have souls. We have souls that are here to be shaped and to learn and to grow. And we do not, I think Helen's quotes, I'll misquote it, but we do not grow in ease. We grow through challenging circumstances. That's what really, I try to remind myself of that every challenging experience I go through. What a great opportunity for growth. Yeah.
And well, it's a moment. Us that life insists on that.
Yes. And nobody gets
gaining disability is simply one example of that insistence.
Yes. So I pray this collaborative can become a place that centers disability and that allows us all to learn, all to grow from this. I mean, really, it is a universal experience. I suppose not everyone carries the identity of disability, but we all become disabled at some point, right? I mean, that unless we flash in and flash out, which some people do.
There is disability in everyone's family. It's all around us.
It's all around us.
It's essential to the human condition. It is the human condition.
Yes. Well, thank you for being on this journey with me. And
thrilled and honored to be on this journey with you, my beloved friend.
Well, and I love that you keep bringing us back to ground and earth and physicality. And I think we're ready. I think it's time to start shaping some of these initiatives and fleshing them in the world and seeing where they might. And maybe we'll go on a pilgrimage and a journey until we find our physical home. Who knows where this path will lead?
Yeah, we're making things together, and that's what we want to do, is to continue to do that. Yeah.